When shooting a short film, either as a student or an independent practitioner, your main constraint is going to be your budget. And in recent years, in the past 10 years, DSLR videography and cinematography has really come into its own as a distinct genre within the industry. And indeed, many films on YouTube and on Vimeo will be characterized by the soft depth of field and very cinematic image that a DSLR can give you compared to a dedicated camcorder or video camera in the same price bracket of 20 years ago. So for Black Knight, for her Romeo, I've typically been using Canon DSLRs, in fact exclusively DSLRs. We did a bit of production videography and photography on a Nikon camera. Typically speaking, Canon DSLRs have larger photo sites than Nikon DSLRs. On the same size sensor, either full frame or APS-C, a Canon camera will have fewer pixels, if you will, but they'll be larger. The photo sites, the receptors themselves will be larger, and this typically gives you better low light performance and less noise, generally speaking, although it very much comes down to the processor and the type of sensor itself to dictate how much noise and how much clarity you're going to get. So for our film, we mostly filmed on these cameras here, the Canon 7D, the Canon 5D Mark II, and the Canon 600D, a little bit on the 600D. They're all fantastic cameras, really great for stills as well as video, although the main reason I chose these ones is full 1080p video function in 24, 25, and in this particular, the 7D, higher frame rates, although we actually didn't end up using any of the slow motion footage, which would have been filmed at 720p, so that was 1280 by 720, at 50 frames a second, but we didn't use that in the end just because it wouldn't work well on any kind of screen that's larger than your average computer monitor. The difference between these cameras is actually, like, apart from sensor size, very, very subtle. These two cameras here, the 5D Mark II and the 7D, are both operating on the Digic 4 processor, and the 600D is operating on the Digic 5. Apart from that, there's no difference on the processor. The main difference when it comes down to is sensor size, obviously. One of the reasons that DSLRs are so attractive to the amateur entry-level videography market compared to camcorders is that shallow depth of field, which lends it a certain quality. Arguably, there are many different factors that make an image look cinematic and film-like or filmic. But for many people, shallow depth of field gives you an increased production value in appearance. And typically speaking, that comes down to the sensor. So if we look at the Canon 5D Mark II, the reason this camera is so successful and was one of the, in fact, the first DSLR to shoot video, and it was really done as a gimmick by Canon, is this, which is its full frame sensor. You can't actually see it because it's got the shutter guard down, and I don't want to show it to you because that will probably damage the camera. It won't really, but you know, it's still not great practice. And basically, because of the size of this full frame 35mm sensor, it gives you both quite a wide image, and it also gives you a shallow depth of field. And the reason for this, I don't really have the charts to show you right now. I might show a graphic right here. But, oh, hello cat, how are you doing? So the reason that that's so attractive is it can give you a very, very shallow depth of field with the right lenses. The 5D itself has a, well, when it first was released, the 5D there was a very high standard of video. Hello cat, are you alright? Please don't knock anything over. I'll be very upset if you knock anything over. Good, see that you don't. Good lad. So yes, the 5D Mark II has a fantastic image. It is, however, plagued with issues compared to the newer range of Canon DSLRs and DSLRs and video cameras in general. It's a fairly soft image. It doesn't handle well under grading at all because it's shooting H.264, which is a compressed codec. It's quite highly compressed. It's not bad for delivery, but for actually shooting in, it's not ideal. But then these cameras weren't built for video. It's just an extra function they threw in. Comparatively, the 600D and the 7D, which is my own personal camera, operate with APS-C sensors. Roughly speaking, that equates to a super 35mm crop. It's a 1.x6 crop. So on your image, it's zoomed in 1.6 times. And there are benefits and downsides to this. Downsides, it's not quite as good in low light because the sensor isn't so large, there isn't so much light hitting the sensor. It will be a darker image. So if I compare it back to the 5D, I mean, you can see here from the size of the mirror, which is what you'll be seeing here, the mirror on this one is noticeably smaller than the 5D. And this does have some advantages. Because of the smaller sensor, you will get a deeper depth of field. And this, like for certain projects, that will be a disadvantage. You want to have that very, very shallow depth of field. For certain cinematographers and filmmakers, like for example Stanley Kubrick, they operated with extremely fast, extremely shallow depth of fields. The 70's APS-C sensor, however, while it's a smaller image, you'll need a wider lens to compensate for it. It will give you, generally speaking, will be a bit sharper because it'll be easier to get focus because the depth of field will be deeper than it is on a full frame sensor. When it came to shooting this film, I generally speaking went almost exclusively for the 5D. Reasons for that mainly were framing. Because of the locations and the areas we'd be moving in, it will be very difficult to achieve the adequate width and sharpness on a full frame, on a crop sensor camera like the 7D than it will be compared to the 5D. For many commercial videographers, the sort of people who make music videos, the Canon 7D is often considered to be a superior camera. While it doesn't function as well in low light and does have more noise issues because the sensor is smaller, you're able to fit more glass to it. In addition to supporting full frame glass like this 85mm by Canon, it will also, indeed is advised to use EFS glass, which is specifically designed for crop sensors. This is the 17-85, it's my own personal lens. These lenses, they're often cheaper, they're great. This one has image stabilization, which makes it great for moving shots. The disadvantage of EFS glass, unfortunately, is that they will not fit a full frame body. The sensor's too large, the flange distance is different, and it just doesn't fit. You can get an image out of it if you hold it up to it, but there are very few reasons to do that. With all of these cameras, I've set them to shoot on Cine Style, which is a custom user profile. With the standard profile on these cameras, the image itself is quite contrasty and it's quite rich in colour, but there are disadvantages to this. Because I'm not shooting on a RAW codec or a higher bitrate codec, sort of 200 megabits per second, the image itself, what you see is what you get. It's very much like for photographers comparing JPEGs to RAW images. And these cameras, in their default state, do not have a RAW function. A RAW function is very much like with stills photos, gives you incredible amounts of control. The images themselves are much larger. And thanks to the folks at Magic Lantern, there is now support for the 7D to a degree, the 5D Mark II. In fact, almost all of the DSLRs from the Canon range have some form of RAW hack. And that makes them extremely useful for serious videographers on a budget. Unfortunately, with these cameras, we haven't been able to implement that. And that's led us to improvise with this. Fortunately, the company Technicolor, a post-production house, have developed Cine Style, which is very simply, it's a custom user profile, which you dial on the camera, that removes all of the contrast and all of the in-camera sharpening. In-camera sharpening creates a great deal of problems with moire and aliasing. There is an anti-aliasing filter in these cameras, which gives them quite a soft image. But unfortunately, because the codec itself is quite compressed, when you sharpen it, there's nothing to sharpen. There's no extra detail you can eke out of it, so it becomes quite a nasty, gritty image. What Cine Style does, it removes the in-camera sharpening, which removes these issues of moire and aliasing. Moire being the sort of funny, zigzaggy lines you get in clothing, often in clothing, or things like roofing tiles. And aliasing often works with hard lines as well and gives you a zigzag through that, roughly speaking. When using Cine Style, even though it's not ideal, what it does is it gives you a lot more dynamic range and latitude compared to the standard image. With particularly where you'll notice it is in areas like greys and blacks. They won't appear so black with Cine Style. There'll be less saturation and there'll be less difference between light and dark sources. And then in post, you're able to control that. You're able to control that in Premiere Pro or Avid or After Effects, whatever compositing suite you're using, editing suite, NLE you're using. Which gives you much more control of your image. It's not ideal, it's certainly not up to the standard of sort of the cinema line of Canon cameras like the C300 or the C100 or the FS700 by Sony. But what it does offer you is the increased latitude and range when you're editing. In terms of lenses, I've used quite a big variety. In addition to the sort of the more conventional EF glass, this is the EF85, which is a fantastic lens. It's very fast, it's a great portrait lens on a full frame camera, and it almost verges into telephoto range because of the 1.6 crop on the 7D and the 600D. While these are great lenses for particularly photography and videography to a degree, the main problem with these is the focus wheels are quite difficult to operate, and there's also quite a degree of handling noise. When it came to shooting in more controlled environments where I'd be able to particularly either have a focus puller working with me or being able to focus completely on the focus pulling itself, I vastly prefer manual lenses for this. When I first got into filmmaking and photography in general, in my second year of university, when I really sort of kicked it off, and I bought my 7D, my main go-to lenses were by a company called Helios. I've only actually got one of them with me right now. The other one is upstairs, and the other one is also upstairs. And the advantages of manual lenses, for a start, they're much cheaper than these lenses because they don't have to have the autofocusing capabilities of a more advanced lens, a newer lens. These ones, particularly this particular lens, which is the Helios 135 2.8 f-stop lens, they were made about 40-50 years ago, so they are much cheaper now. And the build quality is often excellent. The image quality is fantastic. These ones are M42 Pentax screw mounts. which is a very, very common design for lens mounting, and they're very easily adapted using adapter rings. The lenses themselves have a really fantastic image quality. They're often quite bespoke. There's a look to them that, you know, some people like, some people won't like. For example, this one here has a very purplish tint. And it also has fantastic lens flares, this one. This one I use for almost all of my portrait work. The crop is somewhat inhibiting on the 7D and the 600D with an APS-C crop. On the full frame, it's quite usable. It is tight, it's very tight, but it's not overly tight. When filming this film, my main go-to lens was the Zeiss Planar T50 1.4, which is a fantastic manual lens built by Carl Zeiss, a very highly regarded lens manufacturer. The planar design is one of the oldest in existence. It's also one of the most copied. The lens itself is extremely high quality. The addition to being very sturdily built, this thing can take an absolute beating if you were to so deal out such a beating. It's also extremely fast at 1.4, which is the fastest owning aperture the university or myself owns in this range of cameras and lenses. The image itself is very contrasty. It's quite a sharp lens. It's not the sharpest, but the contrast adds a sense of sharpness, and also has quite an appealing green tint. It doesn't tint the image itself, but sort of greens are more rich due to the multi-coating on the lens, which prevents scratches and also prevents too much lens flaring, which, again, for example, with the Helios lens, the lens coating doesn't seem to work as well. Either that's a flaw in the design or it's worn off over time, but it gives very appealing lens flares, whereas the other lenses in this range, because they've been multi-coated, generally aren't so, generous with their lens flares. They're not so obvious. You often have to eke those out in post-production. In addition to the 50mm, I've also been working with the Canon 28mm 1.8, which is what I'm currently shooting on right now, which is a very appealing wide-angle lens. It's very bright thanks to the fast aperture of 1.8, and on a full-frame body, it's also very wide and gives quite a shallow depth of field. At the moment, I'm stopped down to 2.8, so it's a fairly workable depth of field. At 1.8, we'd be looking at my face sort of being in focus, but then my hands here being out of focus. And actually that lens itself is extremely usable. The focus ring is quite difficult to operate. It has an infinite focus wheel, and it's quite clackety and makes a bit of a handling noise, but it's a very usable lens. In addition to that, I've also been using the Sigma 10 to 20mm. This lens says it's an EF lens. It works with both cameras, technically speaking, but you do get a very heavy vignette because it's such a wide lens on such a wide aperture, such as the 5D. You will get black cropping around the edges. It's really meant for use on EFS cameras with APS-C sensors like the 7D and the 600D. The Sigma is extremely wide at 10 to 20. At 10mm, it gives an extremely broad image, much wider than can typically be achieved on, for example, with a 15mm lens on the 5D, because you will get cropping. But with this, there'll be no cropping, no vignetting, on the 7D or the 600D, and it works extremely well for sort of landscape shots, for sort of cinematic B-roll. For example, when I was shooting in London, I did quite a few scenes on this. It turns out in the end I didn't use it because the image itself was quite noisy. It was late at night, and the 7D does not function as well in low light as the 5D, even when working with CineStar, which removes a lot of the crushed blacks and blown out highlights. In addition to these, of course, there are more specialist lenses. For example, I use the 10 to 20 on the 7D and the 600D, not so much on the 5D due to the extreme crop factor that this has been designed for, because it's so wide. On a full frame body, you will get heavy vignetting, black blurring around the edges, where simply it's too wide for the sensor is too wide for the lens itself. In addition to my standards and my wide-angle lenses which I've been using, I've also been using my own personal 50-500 for my telephoto work. It's a very versatile lens, at 50 at its widest and 500 at its most heavily zoomed in. It's a heavy lens, but fortunately the focus wheel is extremely heavy and makes it very usable in cinematic situations. It's not easy to mount on a shoulder cam, and like tripods, this will practically break the tripod. But it did offer me some very interesting uses, particularly on examples like bridges, where I could really select my depth of field and then I could follow the actress as she's walking towards the camera. Not many of those shots actually made it into the film because unfortunately there was quite a heavy degree. Because it was so heavy on a comparatively light tripod, it did make for quite a vibrating, shaky image. Most of my stuff was filmed on a tripod. Most of the time it was a Manfrotto 504 or 501 tripod, which is a nice, very fluid head, great videography on a sturdy pair of legs. I also used this, which is my 20 to 30 pound shoulder cam, which I bought on Amazon. For those in the know, so like the blue colour here typically indicates cheap. You'll see these all over Amazon, all over eBay. It's very usable. It's not at all usable though with heavier lenses like this. It makes it a very, very challenging device to use and very, very shaky. But particularly if you learn how to use it and the way you move and the way you walk with it, you can get quite a fluid image certainly compared to handheld, and much easier and better looking than simply holding your tripod, which is another way of stabilizing your image compared to Handycam. You have more points of contact and greater leverage. For sound, I was actually mostly using a Fostex audio recorder, which I don't have with me, unfortunately. They're all booked out today. I also used the Zoom H4n recorder, which is currently what is recording the sound, which is a really great compact SD card recording device. Fantastic built-in microphones, but also has XLR support, I believe. Yes, it does. We didn't actually use this for much of the production, but we always had it on hand just in case. My go-to microphone has been the ME66 by Sennheiser. It's a super cardioid pattern shotgun microphone. Quite affordable as they go, a great sound. I was very lucky with my sound man, Adam Wartsky, who's extremely experienced and was fantastic on the set working with us. He instantly knew where to place the microphone, how best to get the sound out of it, and he's been working at this moment on our sound production. Typically speaking, we'd have 2 of these on set, often operating once. At one point we had 3 operating. 2 on the microphone stand, or 1 microphone stand, the other one operating on a boom. I'm not going to extend this right now because, well, it's not particularly big in here. In addition to having all these lenses and all this equipment, it also is essential to know what settings to have on the camera in order to get the cinematic filmic look that you're after. I've already spoken about shooting in cine style. When filming, I tried at all instances available to shoot at 50 shutter speed at 24 frames a second. These cameras don't actually shoot at a dedicated 24 frames a second, they shoot at 23.976, which is to avoid the power fluctuation on UK power, which would create a flicker in the image at dedicated 24, which is a bit of an issue. More professional cameras will actually shoot in 24, but you'll then have to post-process it differently in order to avoid that flicker. Probably the best thing about using DSLRs is simply the high production value you can get in your image at such a budget level. I mean, for example, the 5D Mark II now goes for about £900. You can get them for about £700, whereas they were about £2,000 when they first came out. The 7D, likewise, now for about £600. When I bought this one, it was £700, and when it first came out, it was much closer to the £1,000 mark. And the 600D now is extremely affordable. It's sort of, £300. And this is actually a much better camera suited for videography. It has a flip-out screen, which gives you, when you're using it, it gives you the ability to look at your image when shooting at challenging angles, which is a very desirable trait. It is, however, a plastic body, whereas these ones are built with a magnesium alloy, which is much, much stronger, can take a fall much better. Having access to all this equipment at such a price point is something that would be unheard of 10 to 20 years ago, and it's really allowed students and independent practitioners to improve the quality of the market. With the saturation of digital technology, there's often been a criticism from analog and traditional media producers of a saturation of low quality material, and that's certainly true still of DSLRs. There are many badly shot DSLR videos out there, many of which have been contributed by myself. But with the flexibility of a camera with so many controls and lenses, where you can control the aperture, where you can control your focus length, distance, where you can even control the zoom on some lenses, which is a traditional feature of most camcorders, you're able to really control your image, and with experience, you'll be able to tailor it to suit the look of your project. And that's been a really fantastic opportunity working this project, is that I've been able to really control my image and get the artistic look that I've never been able to get before out of more traditional camcorders, particularly when they're shooting on a compressed codec like H.264 or AVC-HD, or particularly when shooting on DV tapes. So that's all for this episode, talking about the tech which I use on the shoots. In the next episode, we're going to look at post-production and how to take the raw image we get out of these cameras and these sound devices and then try and make it look and sound like an actual film. So I'll see you next time.